Greetings and welcome to TMH English News with me, Delithna Dawalko. UN Special Advisor on Genocide, Wairimu Nidritu, raises alarm over Ethiopia's current crisis. 16 children die of acute malnutrition at the Ida Referral Hospital in the city of Ma'ala, and Human Rights Watch says blocking Tigray aid harms rape survivors. The Special Advisor of the United Nations Secretary General on the Prevention of Genocide, Alice Wairimu Nidritu, has raised alarm at the continued deterioration of human rights due to ethnic violence in Ethiopia and called for a dialogue to address the crisis immediately. According to the East African, in a statement released yesterday, she expressed concern that the escalation of violence, increased incidences of ethnically and religiously motivated hate speech, displacement of population, destruction of property, and terming them as serious indicators of risk of commission for atrocity and crimes. She warned that the further deterioration can have very serious consequences, and not only for the future of the country, but also for the region, including cross-border conflicts. Through genuine and inclusive dialogue, Ethiopians can address the root cause of their divergences and preserve the country's unity and stability, she added. Also, in the dialogue between Ethiopian Prime Minister and Abiy Ahmed, the warring factions led by the Tigray forces and other armed groups was the best way to resolve the crisis at hand. There's also increased politicization of identity and past grievances, increased inflammatory rhetoric, propaganda campaigns, or hate speech, as well as sexual and gender-based violence and creation of or increased support to the militia or the paramilitary groups. She observed that Ethiopia continues to witness intergroup tensions and patterns of discriminations against specific groups, including ethnic profiling, incitement to violence, and allegations of a systematic attack on specific populations. These also continue to risk factor for atrocity crimes, given their potential impact in triggering large-scale violences. Allegations of hate speech by ethnic and religious leaders are particularly concerning, she cautioned. UN humanitarian chief concludes a 4-day visit to Ethiopia as humanitarian crisis continues unabated, and under the Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths concluded his tour in Ethiopia yesterday, and according to OSHA, Griffiths held constructive discussions with the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and his deputy Dema Mokonnen on the humanitarian situations in the country and the challenges that aid organizations face in getting assistance to all Ethiopians in need. Griffiths also met with the African Union's High Representative for the Horn of Africa, former President Olusegun Obasanjo, in support of his efforts. The humanitarian chief also made a 1-day visit to Ma'ala in Tigray region, where he met with the humanitarian partners and engaged with the region's authorities on the need for humanitarian access and protections of their civilians through all areas under their control and respect for humanitarian principles.
While in Ethiopia, Mr. Griffiths addressed challenges related to the suspension of the humanitarian air service flights, the availability of fuel, cash, and supplies, the bureaucratic impediments, including visas for humanitarian staff, and the treatment of humanitarian personnel. He stressed that we, along with our partners, will continue to work with the government of Ethiopia and with local and international partners to support millions of people in need of urgent humanitarian assistance across the country.
Griffiths also met with women affected by the conflict, including survivors of sexual violence, receiving help from the program supported by the UN Population Fund. Member of Tigray Armed Forces Central Command, Getachew Reda, says his forces are not interested in taking power in Ethiopia's capital. In an interview with CNN yesterday, Getachew Reda said Tigray Armed Forces were in the northern part of Shoa, and he added the purpose of this advancement by the Tigray Armed Forces is not to seize any territory.
We're not particularly interested in territory. We are mostly interested in breaking the siege which has been imposed by Abiy Ahmed. Once he realized he has failed in his military ambitions to retake Tigray, what he instituted is a reign of terror, especially by cutting off electricity, cutting off communications, cutting off banking services, and all those things. And our children are starving by their scores on a daily basis, by maybe tomorrow by their hundreds and by their thousands, simply because we said no to tyranny. Our children are being sentenced to death, and we have to break the siege. And the rest of the world, it seems to fail to understand how serious the problem is. Humanitarian aid has been blocked from the people of Tigray. Children are dying because of such a blockade, and we have to break this blockade.
Right.
And we'll continue to take appropriate measures to make sure that Abiy's chokehold on Tigray is broken.
An American analyst, Cameron Hudson, says the Ethiopian government's blockade on Tigray is the last piece of leverage in his after losing footing on the war. Cameron Hudson, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Africa Center, told CNN that the siege has put millions of people's lives at risk.
For the better part of the last 4 or 5 months, a total humanitarian blockade of the region. You've seen skyrocketing cases of famine where nearly 500,000 people now are at risk of fatality due to famine. And in the last month, there have been absolutely no shipments of any humanitarian aid whatsoever, food, medicine, anything. So this is really, I think, the last piece of leverage that the government of Ethiopia has.
Hudson added, Tigray forces are now at the driver's seat in the conflict that the Prime Minister and his government are reeling from.
Well, there's clearly a full court press going on internationally. You're seeing for the first time in a long time the UN Security Council taking notice, putting out some very harsh statements, consensus statements that include China and Russia, which is surprising. And also seeing the African Union finally, I think, take a lead role in trying to bring this to some kind of ceasefire resolution. I think it's hard to say right now. Obviously, the Tigrayans are on their front feet. They are marching towards the capital. They are in the driver's seat of this conflict. The Prime Minister and his government, I think, are reeling right now. We're seeing them lash out at the UN, lash out at international mediators who are trying to come in and force a kind of a political dialogue. So I really think this is very personality driven right now. And it's a big question whether or not the Prime Minister will see the writing on the wall and walk back from the edge.
Cameron said breaking the siege and following an unimpeded humanitarian access would help minimize the crisis in the short term. 16 children died due to acute malnutrition at the Ida Referral Hospital in the region of Ma'ala, and Dr. Mohammed Mustafa told reporters that 205 children admitted to the hospital for acute malnutrition, 16 children have died. He attributed the deaths to complete blockade on the Tigray region by the Abiy Ahmed's government, and Dr. Mohammed also said that the hospital has now suspended medical services due to the lack of medicine and medical equipment that the hospital is facing as a result of the blockade as well. At least 16 United Nations local employees have been detained in Ethiopia's capital as provided by the UN. A government spokesman asserted that they were held for their participation in terror under a state of emergency as the country's year-long war escalates and the ethnic Tigrayans face a new wave of arrests. All the detained staffers are Tigrayan, a humanitarian worker told the Associated Press, speaking on conditions of anonymity for the fear of retaliation. UN spokesman Stefan Dujarric said that the UN was given no reason for the detentions, but that Tigrayans, included lawyers, have reported widespread detentions in Addis Ababa since the state of emergency was declared, saying people are being picked up on the basis of their ethnicity alone. They are being detained in facilities against their will, said by spokesperson Stefan, told reporters, adding that some were detained over the past few days during a visit to Ethiopia by the UN humanitarian chief. And he also said another 6 staff members were detained, but then later released, and the number of employees' dependents have also been detained. The UN has asked Ethiopia's foreign ministry for their immediate release.
These staff have been detained. As far as I know, we have not received, they've not been charged. We have not received any clear indication as to why they're being detained, so we would like them to be released.
One more question on call.
Of course.
In Washington, State Department spokesman Ned Price told reporters that if the reports are true and the detentions of the people are based on ethnicity, it's completely unacceptable. The UN has 2,398 and 1,077 international staff working in Ethiopia. In related news, authorities have detained more than 70 drivers working with the United Nations. A UN spokesperson said, amid international alarm over reported widespread arrests of ethnic Tigrayans as the war escalates in the country's north. The UN spokesperson said the drivers are contractors of the UN's World Food Program and were arrested in Samara, in the capital city of the Afar region. Human Rights says the siege on the Tigray is preventing sexual violence survivors from getting post-rape care. Human Rights Watch released an 89-page report yesterday titled, "I Will Always Remember That Day: Access to Services for Gender-Based Violence Survivors in Ethiopia's Tigray Region," and the report documents the serious health impact, trauma, and the stigma experienced by the rape survivors ages 6 to 80 since the beginning of the armed conflict Tigray and since November. The Ethiopian government effective siege of Tigray since June is doubly victimizing survivors by denying them critical medical and psychological mental health support. The report stated that the African Union and the UN and the international donors should support the international inquiry and press all parties to the Tigray conflict to halt abuses and allow rapid and unimpeded aid access. Human Rights Watch interviewed 28 health and aid workers, donors, sexual violence survivors, and their witnesses. And Human Rights Watch also reviewed 43 additional individual cases of sexual violence in the Tigray region and documented through anonymized medical intake notes from survivors and service providers, and conducted telephone and written interviews with the Tigrayan regional authorities as well. Human Rights Watch sent a summary of findings and requests for information to the Ethiopian federal authorities, but did not receive any replies. France says immediate decisions are needed to obtain a ceasefire in Ethiopia, and France called on the federal government, the regional government of Tigray, and its allies to give an immediate proof of their openness to dialogue. The parties must immediately cease hostilities, freeze the positions of their forces, refrain from internationalizing the conflict, and agree on the gradual withdrawal to pre-conflict positions, France said in a statement on Monday. France called on the Ethiopian authorities to withdraw the designation of the TPLF as a terrorist organization in order to open the urgent negotiation talks. The statement also said the regional government of Tigray must recognize that the future of the Tigray region can only be determined through an inclusive and national dialogue, and that the constitutional agreements, including on the border dispute with the Amhara region. France called on all parties to guarantee access to the prisoners and to initiate discussions with a view to their release as soon as possible. That wraps up our news for the day. Thank you for tuning in.